Hello, everyone. Welcome back to part two of my video series on why do people speak up against injustice and atrocity, and why don't people speak out more often? This particular video is going to be about when do people speak up and can it prevent atrocity? So, in part one, we talked about silence, why ordinary people speak out, and what keeps people from speaking out and the consequences they sometimes face for speaking out. In part two, we'll turn the topic around and look at it from different angles. So, the first thing we want to talk about is moral identity centrality, and specifically that the idea that early dissenters are driven by internal standards, principled conscience, rather than social rewards. So these are, and that there is a difference between speaking out early and then the more reactive style of speaking out when atrocity already happens. We'll dive into people who speak out early, the patterns that they're recognizing, and so we want to ask the question: is moral courage reactive? So let's talk about reactivity first of the moral courage. And yes, often it is. Does that mean it's not good? No, it's still very important. But yes, moral courage can and is often reactive. Most large-scale social mobilizations occur after visible harm. It's already too late by that time to prevent the beginnings of atrocity. But preventive moral courage in the early dissent tends to occur in individuals with high moral attentiveness, pattern recognition ability, lower dependence on social approval, and higher tolerance for ambiguity. And these individuals are not necessarily bold in temperament. They're often principled, internally anchored, and less conformity driven, which expresses itself as a bold trait. And overall, the data suggests the strongest correlates of moral courage are moral identity centrality, empathy, conscientiousness, internal locus of control, and the willingness to tolerate social rejection. And the weakest correlates to moral courage are, so the weakest, meaning there's not correlation to these, is extroversion, dominance, social dominance as a primary factor, and sensation seeking. So impulsivity does not factor into it, or sensation seeking. Dominance as a primary expression of one's personality does not factor into it, and extroversion does not factor into it. And importantly, moral courage is negatively correlated with blind obedience and authoritarian conformity. So people that are more apt to blindly obey and conform to authoritarianism are negatively correlated with the trait of moral courage. And so the big insight here is that courage is not the absence of fear. It's really the ability to regulate fear. And it is fear integrated with values. It's regulated boldness, and it's controlled risk. And if you want to hear more about a deeper dive into those things, please check out part one of this video. The data suggests that the most morally courageous individuals are not necessarily the loudest or the most aggressive. They are often the most internally anchored. And it's accurate to say that moral courage is reactive a lot of the time. So there are a few things about that, though. Sociological data confirms that mass mobilization, social courage, typically follows visible harm. So protests after an event, an atrocity, an event, an injustice. However, preventative moral courage, intervening before the harm spreads, so that's more like a proactive expression, is a distinct psychological profile. So there's a difference between the reactive and proactive. Research shows that the proactive form of moral courage, that is preventative moral courage, and that distinctive psychological profile will express will be expressed in individuals that possess high moral attentiveness. So the cognitive habit of chronically screening situations for ethical implications, almost like threat seekers, people that are always on, alert for subtleties and sensitive to ethical changes or anomalies. And these people with moral attentiveness, they often see harm before others do. So they're more apt to have situational awareness related to ethics in an environment. And then the personality profile, civil courage versus moral courage. Based on the study, civil courage versus moral courage, the strongest correlation to moral courage is moral identity centrality. And this is the single strongest predictor. So based on this study, moral identity centrality was the single strongest predictor, which means that moral values are central to the person's definition of self. For example, I am a person who does not lie, or I am a person who is just and fair. Like there's a moral identity that is possessed by people who display the trait of moral courage. And also empathy, a primary driver for recognizing victim distress, which overrides social fear. So that's the fear tolerance and the fear regulation. It's not being fearless. They still have fear. And also conscientiousness. Conscientiousness consistently predicts moral action because it involves impulse control and adherence to duty. So it's that empathy component, the adherence to duty, to the ethics that are triggered by empathy and connection to others. And the weakest correlates, we'll talk about extroversion and dominance. So what they say about extroversion is being the loudest in a room does not correlate with moral courage. In fact, some studies show extroversion correlates with social courage, speaking up to be seen. And that's the difference between moral courage and social courage. Social courage says, I'm not afraid to speak up, but moral courage is speaking up at a cost, often on behalf of other people. And so dominance is the other piece that weakly correlates. And so social dominance does not correlate with moral courage. Moral courage is often submissive to principles rather than dominant over people. So moral courage is not dominant over people. It is submissive to principles held by that individual. And then regulated boldness. That's the other piece that we loosely touched on in my part 1. So while regulated boldness is likely a synthesized term, it perfectly describes the mechanism of self-regulation in moral psychology. So courage is not the absence of fear. It is the downregulation of fear via the upregulation of values. So there's that balance when the upregulation of values happens, then the downregulation of fear happens in people who display moral courage. And then moral identity. So that's it's the strongest predictor, centrality to self-concept. The weakest predictor is extroversion. Social dominance does not equal integrity. And a primary driver is that moral indignation would be greater than fear in the people that display moral courage. So now we'll deep dive into the internal anchor mechanism. Individuals with moral courage are internally anchored, and this refers to locus of control. So if the person has an external locus, that's basically saying I conform because I fear what the group will do to me, and that's a high conformity type of person. And then the internal locus is I dissent because I fear what I will think of myself if I comply. I think there's another angle to that, which would say I dissent because I fear what I will think of myself if I betray others. So there's that high moral courage where the person who is speaking out is clearly seeing an ethical duty to those they are speaking out on behalf of. And then research shows that for individuals with high moral identity centrality, the social cost of rejection is actually lower than the internal cost of betrayal. And they fear losing their self-respect more than they fear losing the group's approval. So this explains why they can appear principled rather than just like bold. So it's not an external expression of boldness, but an internal principle that feels like an expression of boldness. It's not bold for boldness' sake, or boldness because they're extroverted, or boldness because they're fearless. It's not that. And then now we would need to ask the harder question, when do people actually stand up? History shows us something uncomfortable. Most public outrage is reactive. It follows visible harm. It follows violence. It follows undeniable proof. People often wait for clarity, for consensus. So before harm happens, before it gets to that point, people wait. People wait for clarity. They wait for consensus. They wait for moral safety. But atrocity does not begin with violence. It begins with normalization. If it begins with language, language shifts. It begins with policy shifts. It begins with dehumanization framed as security, cruelty framed as order. And in those early stages, speaking up feels socially dangerous because it almost makes people feel like they're overreacting because nothing catastrophic has happened yet. And I think that's a really important point to stress here. And I think we should sit with that for a second. In the early stages, speaking up feels socially dangerous because nothing catastrophic has happened yet. So it's when small numbers of people might be feeling things, but everyone else is kind of in their own zone, in their own bubble, and not connected to the initial experiences of other people. In some of my upcoming videos, we'll talk about specific atrocities where we can clearly see that happen, and we'll point out those instances. And this is why prevention of atrocity is so difficult. There really has to be a lot of preemptive measures that would protect humans from acting out a default pattern in their primate hierarchy. And now let's talk about the paradox of democracy. This is why democracy is so important and can be a chicken and the egg analogy. This is called this chicken and the egg analogy. They call it the paradox of democracy. It is essential for any society to hold structural space and protection for those who notice abuses. But in order to make space for those people who are going to be speaking out, who have that moral courage and that ethical foundation and framework, that ethically central identity, there have to be protections for them. And so if there are no protections, how are they going to be effective or have the space to speak out? And when something happens, it's important for them to be protected by the foundations of democracy to speak out. So next time you get angry at if you're one of those that are watching this video and you find yourself getting angry at protesters or demonstrators because they're not allowing abusive authoritarians to do their job, remember that these very protesters over time have as much to do with keeping our country free as anything else. If a democracy isn't tested, if free speech isn't in practice all the time, it runs the risk of regression. And there are examples of that in history. So there's a risk. Open societies create space for bad actors and to abuse freedom. But we can, as a cure, we cannot close that space without becoming authoritarian ourselves. And then the solution, if there is any way to simplify that into a soundbite, we rely on functional opposition. And this suggests that protesters are not anti-system, as people would like to assert. People who disagree with protests or speaking out against abuses, those protesters and demonstrators are not anti-system. They're actually a critical function of the system, alerting the body politic to infection before it becomes fatal. And a lot of times, you may be wondering, well, why do people get angry at protesters? Why are people so incensed when they see people standing up for other people? Well, psychologically, anger at protesters often stems from a disruption of order. So the people that are getting really upset, they have an expectation of order. They don't like to see people disrupt that order. So historical data confirms, however, though, that civil disobedience, it's a communication tool. And that's a really interesting way to look at civil disobedience and protests and demonstrations, is that civil disobedience is a communication tool used when normal channels, voting and courts, are clogged or deaf, when the normal channels are not working for serving the people. And the shift, instead of seeing protesters or demonstrators as blocking the road or disrupting the order, see them as clearing the path for future rights. So this chicken and the egg dynamic reveals the delicate paradox of democracy. National entities must possess the structural integrity to protect dissenters, yet often it is the dissenters who protect the integrity of the institutions. When public disruptions feels inconvenient, consider this reframing. These acts of friction are not flaws in the system, but its immune response. So almost as if the people that pick up that ethical situational awareness early, they're like an immune response to the body politic. They are the white blood cells that are fighting infection, so to speak. So by making invisible abuses visible, these individuals act as the braking mechanism that prevents authoritarian slide.